thank you for these 2 days, today, tomorrow, really a step back and an opportunity to assess many different aspects of Ukraine, and in this case today, particularly looking at Ukraine and Congress's role in Ukraine. It's especially a privilege for me to speak this morning on the issues, particularly of the Captive Nations Week resolution and also the resolution that brought into being the Shevchenko Monument here in Washington, D.C. These are two very clear examples of really superb cooperation between the Ukrainian American community, all of the organizations, and Congress. It is also a very special privilege for me in that regard to talk about the author of those two resolutions, my father, Ambassador Lev Dobriansky, who was formerly president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, and someone who was very, very dedicated, truly all his life, to the issue of freedom, independence of Ukraine, but also, I would say, the independence of those captive nations worldwide. Let me begin first by saying that upon my father's passing, the Washington Times wrote a very beautiful editorial. It was entitled Lev Dobriansky. And I brought it today because I felt that it really captured the very essence of what he was about and what he tried to do, working with so many of you here in this room, in not only focused on the future of Ukraine, but also, as I said, captive nations worldwide. He understood very well the importance of the human spirit, and basic human desire for freedom is universal, and that ultimately it is that human spirit which will prevail. In this piece, it talks about his political activism and his long-held belief that then the Soviet Union, that arrangement was so inimical to the human spirit and the desire of people for self-governance that it wouldn't last. It mentions how he authored the Captive Nations Week resolution espousing these sentiments and pledging the support of the American people, and with its passage in 1959. And thereafter, working to ensure that despite many of the shifting, as it's cast here, ebbs and flows of U.S.-Soviet relations, that Congress and the White House would celebrate it annually for nearly 5 decades. At the end, in the piece, it cites President Bush when he went to the groundbreaking of the Victims of Communism Memorial statue here in Washington, and he said, quote, "Lev was a leader who helped tear down the walls of tyranny and deliver hope to millions of people around the world. These sentiments we fully and heartily share." So let me tell you a bit about the story and dig a little bit deeper. Oris gave an overview, but dig a little deeper about the story of first the Captive Nations Week resolution, and then about the resolution leading to the Shevchenko Monument. The background of the resolution first was my father in 1959, when he was on the faculty of the National War College, was thinking about a variety of ideas. And one of his concerns was that there was a kind of growing indifference in many American circles, basically about the status, but also, and not only about the status, but also about the strategic value of the captive nations. There was, at the time, really an effort to have a kind of acceptance, an acquiescence to that existence of the captive nations, the existence then of the Soviet Union. Well, it was the murder of Imre Nagy in 1958, who was the former Hungarian premier, that in a way was a kind of a catalyst at the time when my father prepared a concurrent resolution on Captive Nations Days, as it was called at the time, and managed to interest then Congressman Cretella of Connecticut in it, who introduced it, a resolution, on July 2nd in 1958. This was calling for a Captive Nations Year, and this original resolution was designed to observe the independence and other historic days of the captive nations throughout the entire year. Well, it was basically geared towards keeping the subject of national captivity steadfastly before the American public. Well, that resolution was considered by the House Judiciary Committee, and its chairman was the one who broke a tie vote, casting his vote against it at the time. So it didn't pass. And his reason stated was fundamentally that it would be very overwhelming to have so many days of observance every day of the year. And in a way, it might even diminish the focus and the attention. So interestingly enough, there were two occasions in 1959 that provided a kind of a hook, if you will. There was the Geneva Conference, and also at the time the forthcoming visit of Vice President Nixon to Moscow. Both of these occasions were somewhat impetus for looking at the current events, and then also looking at, here in the United States, our own Independence Day and the importance of the 4th of July and the symbolic weight that that would carry. So, my father, with his hat of President of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, came back and sought the cooperation of Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, and also Senator Jacob Javits of New York. And then also on the House side, Congressman Bentley of Michigan and Feehan of Ohio. And I want to underscore something that Ora said, which I think was also very important at the time, and that was a recognition of the importance of bipartisanship. The four who I mentioned represented bipartisanship. Both Republicans and Democrats joined forces here in advancing this resolution. So it was on June 22nd when Senator Douglas formally introduced the resolution, which became known as SJ Res 111, and Senator Javits joined with him. And during that time, they left open some time for discussion, and also, not just only for discussion, but also to get those members to step forward and to sign on. The list is a long one. But then on the House side, you also had Bentley, who introduced a parallel measure in the House and classified that as HJ Res 435. And it was in these resolutions that the focus was looking at basically coinciding the Captive Nations Week, as it became, with the 4th of July independence. So it became every third week of July is the week of, and it's the third week in July, that is the time for recognition of Captive Nations Week annually. The decision was made to allow time for preparation of ceremonies. Also, in the event that Congress, the measure was passed by Congress, and the President would issue a proclamation. In other words, when they were debating and discussing this, they wanted time, so it became the third week of July. Well, it was on July 6th, the resolution was unanimously passed by voice vote in the Senate. And Senator Eastland, at the time, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, was in large measure very much responsible for the expedition. Another person who I want to recognize was House Majority Leader then, Congressman John McCormick of Massachusetts, who also was very aggressive in terms of the passage of the resolution. And then Congressman Michael Feehan on July 8 introduced HA Res 459 to parallel the amended measure of the Senate. The role played by Congressman McCormick and by these others really can't be praised enough. And I want to just share with you one of the statements that McCormick made at the time to give you the flavor of the discussion that took place. He declared, quote, "This is a very important resolution that will have tremendous effect on the minds of men and women everywhere throughout the world who are subjected to communist dictation and who desire to be free under their own law," unquote. I share that quote with you because as we all sit here today and we're focused on Ukraine, the importance of this resolution, it was important not only to Ukraine, but it's also important to those captive nations and captive individuals worldwide. The measure was unanimously passed by voice vote on July 9, and what culminated in President Eisenhower signing the resolution into public law, which became Public Law 8690, and he then issued the very first proclamation on July 17. As you can imagine, that when that proclamation was issued, and I mentioned the visit then of Vice President Nixon to Moscow, it was a focus of that visit. It did touch a very raw nerve. I want to share, though, a statement made by President Eisenhower. He said, quote, "I said frequently that the United States would never believe and never accept the idea that a true peace had been established in the world until every single nation had the right to express its own views about its own destiny. And I said the United States would always use whatever peaceful methods were available to it to bring about this opportunity," unquote. I share that with you because it really embodies the importance of this resolution then and now, and also as we step back and we watch what's happening on the ground in Ukraine today, truly the critical nature of, I would use the word, peaceful protest, and also the victory of ideas that matter. Well, once the resolution was passed, there were many articles and many statements, and the New York Times did an editorial on Captive Nations Week. And it stated that the real purpose of this Captive Nations Week observance, therefore, is to keep the plight of the peoples freshly in our minds. It went on to say it may help them to know that we have not forgotten them. It ought to help us in the moral sense if we continue to remember. And that is very true. But at the same time, there's another element that my father continued to underscore. And that is, the greater purpose is also to accentuate the strategic, political, and military value of all captive nations, at the time both within and out of the Soviet Union, and necessarily taken as an aggregate. So as you can imagine, Public Law 8690 has remained in force to this present day, and mainly because of its very realistic, concise framework and outlook. There were very dominant concepts that were also drawn upon and built upon in many other documents, like national independence, democratic process, interdependency of peoples and nations, also the threat to the security of the United States and of all free peoples of the world, religious freedoms, individual liberties, a powerful deterrent to war, and one of the best hopes for a just and lasting peace. These were all elements of the resolution, which I thought was important to recite and just to remember today. Let me end this piece and then say a few words about the Shevchenko Monument. In conclusion, on the piece of the Captive Nations Week resolution, it was interesting going back and reading some of the statements made by then Senator Javits and also, at the time, Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania. And I want to just share them with you. Senator Javits said, quote, "Laid bare, communism is seen to be imperialism by force, but with better propaganda technicians." And then he went on to say, "We in the West have no fear of such a free expression." Khrushchev, who was in power at the time, he said, "can answer this challenge only by allowing free elections under UN auspices for self-determination in the captive nations." And then Hugh Scott said, "If Mr. Khrushchev says we meddled, then my answer to him is that in my judgment it is proper to ask questions of a jailer as to who is in the jail and why they are there." So I just share that with you. Two last pieces of Captive Nations Week resolution. It also brought into being the National Captive Nations Committee. Eminently from the start, its first honorary chairman was the former President Herbert Hoover, and then also it was succeeded by George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO. It had ramifications in so many different ways and so many different circles. And it is, I think, a piece of legislation that we can all be proud of. Let me say a few words about the Shevchenko Monument. And with regard to the Shevchenko Monument, as you can imagine, and Ora said something I think very significant, and that was, At the time, there was the issue of education. Of course, those of us with backgrounds and being of Ukrainian descent, we know what Ukraine is, what our language, our culture, our heritage is. But I would say that one of the important elements was also looking at a permanent symbol, if you will, of the meaning and essence of freedom in Ukraine. Well, we know that the erection of the Shevchenko statue in the nation's capital, which happened in June of 1964, it was unveiled by President Eisenhower. As we know, Taras Shevchenko is the poet laureate of Ukraine who called for, in the last century, had called for a George Washington in Ukraine and for the independence of all non-Russian nations in then the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So here, basically, with the Shevchenko statue, on September 13, 1960, President Eisenhower had signed the resolution, which had been passed by Congress, which authorized the erection of the statue of Taras Shevchenko on public grounds in Washington, D.C. And that resolution, written by my father, was sponsored by Alvin Bentley of Michigan, and it passed through Congress as House Joint Resolution 311. That one came to be known as Public Law 86-749. And why it was significant also was because the Far-Seeing Action prepared an official groundwork also for the celebration of a very significant observance, the significant centennial in 1961, the observance of the death of Taras Shevchenko on March 10, 1861. Shevchenko, as we know, embodies the very essence of freedom. When I look back at the resolution, and I just read to you and conclude on this note, the two first points really state it all as to why this monument is important. It says, whereas throughout Eastern Europe in the last century, and this the name and works of Taras Shevchenko, brilliantly reflected the aspirations of man for personal liberty and national independence. And whereas Shevchenko, the poet laureate of Ukraine, was openly inspired by our great American tradition to fight against the imperialist and colonial occupation of his native land. As you can see, both of these are very much intertwined. The Captive Nations Week resolution, as well as the resolution that resulted in the erection of the Shevchenko monument. Let me say in conclusion that both of these pieces of legislation do really show the importance of our community working very closely with Congress, also the importance of how such pieces of legislation really can bring about and impact change, as we have seen. So let me say again, thank you for this conference and for offering me the opportunity to say a few words about my father and about these two pieces of legislation, and really continue the very dedicated work on behalf of human rights and democracy and freedom, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere. Thank you.